Hello, Wazobia Code developers. Welcome back to Wazobia Code. The last video introduced you to CSS in React. This video will introduce you to UseEffect in React. So now, probably, the question in everyone's mind is, what exactly is UseEffect? Well, UseEffect is a React hook function that allows you to define functions that happens when your React component renders. So technically, UseEffect tells your page, hey, React page, after your UI page loads, after your component renders, I want you to do this. And then this is whatever you define in the UseEffect function. Let's head over to Replit and I can show you a UseEffect example. Okay, so here we are in our Wazobia Code React practice REPL. The first thing we're going to do is that we're going to create a new component called UseEffect component. So let's call it UseEffect comp.jsx. Okay, let's go into this and then we start export default function UseEffect comp. Open this, and the first thing we want to do is ensure that we return div with an h1. So it's just going to be a div, and then inside our div we're going to have a h1 that simply says use effect comp. Okay, good. The next thing we're going to do is that we're going to import this new component that we just made into our app.jx. We import from /use_effect comp. Okay, I have the page running over here, and we go over here, reload the page. Nothing happens because we haven't used the component yet. So we come over here, and this is where we use the component. And then we save that, and then we go over to the page, and here we go, use effect comp. Good. So now let's go back into our use effect comp. So now I'm going to show you exactly how use effect is used. So it's one of those things. Use effect is, like I said, is a function by nature, and it basically tells your page what to do whenever your page renders. Yeah. So just because we know it's a function by nature, most times, where do functions go in React applications? They go before the return. So UseEffect is going to go somewhere in line 2, wherever, just before the return. So there are actually 3 ways that you could use UseEffect. You could use UseEffect as a function that happens once your computer initially renders. So you could use UseEffect in a way, in a syntax, that the function inside your UseEffect happens only once when your component initially renders, when the component initially loads up. Or you could use UseEffect as a function that happens when a specific state or states in your component changes. So you could have some set of states or even one state that you want to monitor, and then when those states change, you want the UseEffect function to happen, and that happens only when those states changes. Or you could use the UseEffect as a function that happens when any state in your component changes. So when any single state in your component changes, you want this UseEffect to happen. Okay, so now let's look at using useState as a function that happens once when your component initially renders. So this is how the syntax is going to look like. You have the UseEffect, you have this arrow function, and then you insert the curly brackets. You actually have the function that you want to happen. So you can define any function here. The function I defined was simply just alerted. So this function is going to happen anytime your page initially renders, and it's going to happen only once. And why that is so is because inside here we have this square brackets. This is a square bracket. This is not a 0. So the square bracket says that this should happen. The UseEffect function, the function inside the UseEffect, should happen only once when my component initially renders. Let's write some code on Replit to give an example of how this works. Okay, so this is our Replit page, and I'm about to show you how to use UseEffect for scenarios where you want the function to execute just once initially when your code renders. So, like the example you saw on the slides, all you need to do is use effect. You import it from React, import use effects from React. So you do use effect, this arrow function, and then you, right now, I just want to alert use, yeah, what should we say? Yeah, okay. Alert that page initially rendered. Okay, let's call it that. Maybe put about this over here. And then to make this official, we have to put this, because this is what makes sure that this happens once and it doesn't go over the rails and happen a million times. So when we go to our React page, we see that the alert happens. And then we click it, and nothing can make this alert happen ever again, because in our use effect we had the empty square brackets telling it that it should happen only once. Okay, so the second way we can use the use effect function is as a function that happens when a specific state or states in your component changes. So in this example here, you can see use effects. The only difference is that inside our square brackets, we have the name of the state or the names of all the states that we want to monitor or we want use effect to happen when those changes. But then apart from that, everything else is the same. Let's go to Replit and look at an example. Okay, so we're back here in Replit. I am going to create two states. Const counter set counter equals to use state 0. Const counter 2 set counter 2 equals to use state 0. Okay, good. I forgot to put my comma over here. Okay, yeah, we're good. So now we're going to create a second use effect. Copy this because it's going to be the exact same. And then whenever counter, let's start with counter. Whenever counter changes, we want this use effect to happen. And what do we do to make that possible? All we just need to do is just write counter inside here. Spelled this wrongly, so I'm going to fix that. Okay, good. So now, how do we change this counter? Well, we can change it with a button. This is an event. We can do some event handling. So we can create a button. And on click, we want to set counter plus 1. Okay, and close the counter, and let's say give it like a p to let us know what we're looking at. This is, make this lowercase. Okay, click counter button. Okay, and when this is clicked, counter is going to change, and then when counter changes, this use effect is going to happen because counter changes. Now I wanted to alert that counter was changed. So real quick, there's an error I made. I just need to do this over here. Okay, so now that should fix. And then give the button a button. Counter button. Okay. And close. And you come over here, alert the counter was changed because that was the first. Let's refresh the page and see. So alert that the page initially rendered, alert the counter was changed. Okay, so now what you're going to see is that, so we got alerts that the page initially rendered and alert that the counter was changed. Alert the page initially rendered, that's going to happen initially when our page runs and only then. Alert that the counter has changed. Well, yeah, at the beginning of our code, counter is going to change from nothing to 0. So yeah, of course, we're going to get an alert that counter has changed. But now what you notice is that whenever we click this button, we're going to get an alert that counter was changed. But we were not going to get an alert that the initial page got loaded. Let's actually add something more interesting to this. Let's add a second button. So a second set of this. And let's add a second counter. So click counter 2 button, set counter 2, counter 2 plus 1, counter 2 button, and now that's all we need to do. So we come here, alert that the counter was changed, alert the page initially loaded. Okay. So we click counter 2. Nothing happens when we click counter 2, but we click counter 1, something happens. Okay, let's go over here, and then instead of counter, let's make it counter 2. Okay, so we go here, alert the counter was changed. Okay, and then now we click counter, nothing happens. But then we click counter 2, alert the counter was changed. Okay, we see that. And then let's try this. Let's try both counter and counter 2. Counter and counter 2. You come over, alert the counter was changed. Counter was changed. Counter was changed. So now we can click on both of them, and after we click on both of them, we see changes for the both of them. Well, that is exactly how UseEffect works when you use the square brackets and put something inside. Whenever that thing changes, whenever the state that's inside the square bracket changes, so that is these states, the function gets called. Okay, let's change this back to counter because we are going to need this to show an example. Because we are going to need this to show an example. So the third way we can use UseEffect is as a function that happens when any state in your component changes. So this is not just one state that you want to look at, just in general. If anything on your page changes, this UseEffect function would be called and it would run. Okay, so let's do that. So it's almost the same syntax from what we can see. Just copy this, then we paste it here. And the only difference is that we remove this bracket entirely and all we have is this. So alert that something changed. So that's what we're doing. So when we get this, we just alert that something changed. It doesn't matter what it is, but then just in general, because of this format, if anything changes, we're going to get alerted that it changed. Let's create one more state to show this. Let's call this name. Set name, and then use state. Let's start it as done. Okay, and then we're going to come down here, and then we're going to create what's this? I don't remember making this. We delete that. That's not important. Okay, so we're going to create an input button. Input. Okay, and then on change, what do we want to do when it's changed? Well, easy. We want to set name to, remember, we have to grab the event dot target dot value. Okay, so we set the name to event dot target dot value. Okay. So now what we're going to do now is we're going to go into our page, alert that something has changed. Okay, so now let's see. Click on button, alert that counter was changed, but we also get alert that something has changed. That's what we have from here, alert that something has changed. Click on counter 2, alert that something changed. Because remember, right now, our UseEffect where we monitor a specific state is monitoring just counter, not counter 2. But everything else, whenever we change everything else, even the text box, alert that something has changed, alert that something has changed, alert that something has changed. Whenever we change anything under this component, under the UseEffect component, we are going to get the function, the alert function, shown to us. Because using this syntax of UseEffect says if any state at all that I'm monitoring changes, I want you to perform this function. It doesn't matter what the state is. I don't care what the state is, just perform this function. Using this syntax over here from lines 11 to 13 says, look at this list of states I'm giving you. If any state in this list of state changes, I want you to perform the function above. So just look at this list of states. If any of them change, perform the function above. And then with this use of use state over here, with the empty bracket, it says, when my page renders initially for the first time, I want you to perform this function. And only then and there do I want you to perform this function. Okay, everyone, so we've learned how to use UseEffect, and now we're going to use UseEffect to improve our recipe sharing app. What we're going to do is that now, once the page renders, we are going to get our data of recipes, and then we're going to use that to populate our states, our recipe states. This is going to be I hope you're excited to see this. I'm excited to teach you this. So let's go forward and get started. So this is our recipe sharing application. We're about to do our changes in use state. Well, the change we're going to make is going to be in the recipe details over here, recipe details.jsx. Let me close a bunch of these pages over here so we have the space. Okay, so we're looking for recipe details.jsx. Here it is. And so what we want to do is that we want a scenario where once the page loads, our UseEffect function gets the recipes and then it stores them into the recipe state, and then we can then use that to do whatever we're doing over here. And that is exactly how front end and back end communicates. You have a backend that has whatever data it has, and then in React you have a front end. And then when the page loads, it gets all the data from the backend. When the page initially loads, the first time it loads, it gets all the data from the backend, and then it populates all the states it needs. Then it uses that data to make as many components it needs to show the data in a good visual UI way. That's exactly what we're going to do. We're not going to make a backend for this because that is too complex, and that's something that I want to teach you how to do properly. What we're going to do instead is that we're going to make a JSON file. Then we're going to read our recipes from that JSON file and then store those recipes in states, and then basically have our application work the way it works right now. So the first thing we're going to do is that we're going to create this JSON file. Okay, so go over here, src, add a file. So what we're going to call this JSON file is recipe data.json. Okay, we have our JSON, and then I'm going to copy some code I have written out over here. You can just find this inside the replit. The replit is going to be in the description of the video. Just go over there, copy the replit, copy the recipe data JSON, and then you can use it and then make your program. Or if you are feeling fancy, you can go ahead and make your own recipe data.json. This is just the syntax: recipe title, chocolate cake, comma, description, comma, recipe ingredients, comma, recipe steps, comma. However you see fit, just go ahead and do this how you want to do it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do now is we're going to load the recipe from the JSON, and then we're going to set our states to that. So however you see fit, just go ahead and do this. Okay, so now we're going to open our recipe details.jsx. And then what we want to do is that we want to load the data from the JSON, then use that to populate our states. Well, the first thing we have to do is import the JSON. So we import and recipe data, give it a name from recipe data.json. Okay, that is good. And now we're going to use our we're going to create our state that's going to store this. Let's call it recipe set recipe. So we are now getting a recipe object. A recipe object, kind of like a recipe dictionary, where the keys you have are recipe title, and then for that the value is chocolate cake, recipe description, and this is the value, recipe ingredients, this is the value, recipe steps. So we're kind of getting like a dictionary that signifies a recipe. Okay, so recipe, set recipe, and then what we're going to do is that we're going to start that as a use state that is null. Use state that is null. Okay, we really do not need this anymore because we don't need all of these anymore because we are changing them right now to just use one recipe. Okay, good. So now we're going to use our use effect. So use effect. Okay, this. So, and remember when I said this is something that we want to happen when the page first runs, and then we don't want it to happen ever again. So that means you're going to do this. So what do we want? Well, we want to set our recipe to recipe data. So when the page initially loads, we want to set the value of our recipe to the recipe data gotten from our JSON. Okay, that works up to now. But then there's still some things we need to change. Previously, we had recipe name, recipe description, recipe ingredients, and recipe steps as their own states. But now we just have one recipe object. Well, the next thing we need to do now is set get the name from the recipe object, get the recipe name from the recipe object, and get the recipe description from recipe object. So that's just simply going to be recipe dot recipe name, because as we can see, recipe title, I was wrong. So not recipe name, but recipe title. And the reason for that is because as we can see in the JSON, recipe title is a key value in the recipe JSON. Okay, the next thing we need is recipe description, recipe, and it's called recipe. Yeah, recipe description, recipe description, and then the next thing we need here is recipe dot recipe ingredient, and finally recipe dot recipe steps. Okay, we can just do a quick double check and make sure we have everything right. Yeah, everything does look right. So the next thing I want to do is just remove this change food button. We don't need it anymore. It's useless to us. Then we go ahead and we run our code. We wait for the code to run. It's going to take a while. I'm just going to open this on a new tab over here. We forgot to do something very important. We forgot to import use effect. So here we are, here's our page, and then we can see that everything works exactly how it works before. The only difference that we've made is that now we get data from the recipe JSON, and we use a use effect to grab that data the first time our page loads, and then we paste that data in to our page, into this new state we've created to store the data. And then we now pass that state down to our child components. The code for all the code for this replet be posted in the description. So if you ever want to go back to the code, the original code, look at it to see some items you've missed, you can always go there to look. That's all the content we have for today. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you understood the concept explained in this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Stay tuned to learn how to code with What's Up Your Code.